Episode 7 of An Ordinary Battalion at War, the story of the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment in the Great War. Episode 7, The First Christmas. We had left the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment as part of the 12th Brigade, the 4th Division of the British Army, and we had left them in the area of Plugstreet Wood. They were on the southern flank of the salient around the town of Ypres, and this is during the Battle of First Ypres, where the Germans are trying to attack and push the British, French and Belgian forces back out of Belgium. Much of the action is taking place to the north and northeast of where the 2nd Essex are, and they find themselves in a kind of square that we can see on this screen here. Plugstreet Wood at the top of the screen, at Laguerre where they were fighting on the 21st of October, just to the side of the yellow restaurant dot. Touquet down the bottom. Many French towns and Belgian towns are repeated, so this is not the Le Touquet on the coast. Bizet, which is sometimes called Le Bizet in the British War Diaries. This is the kind of the area which the 2nd Essex are going to see out the Battle of First Ypres. We've already seen how during the First Battle of Ypres that the British military were getting very close to being overwhelmed, and reserves were depleted, and so battalions would often be detached and sent off to putty up the line somewhere else. And on some occasions it wasn't even battalions, it was companies. For example, on the 22nd of October, Captain Purcell is told to take a company into action. And he takes B Company, which was actually the divisional reserve, so it's quite a small reserve. And he was told to move to a farm called a Desborough Farm, which is pretty much in the middle of this picture with a blue moat around it. There, the expectation, he was going to meet up with 2 companies of the King's Own and 1 of the Rifle Brigade, and somehow merge these 4 companies, who don't normally work together, into a battalion to carry out an attack. Now, on arrival at the farm, the other 3 companies had disappeared, leaving B Company of the 2nd Essex by itself. So Captain Purcell speaks to a staff officer from his own brigade, 12th Brigade, and decides to carry out the attack anyway. And he puts B Company into one line to make them look like a bigger frontage, I assume, and to look a bigger force. And they advance towards the east, towards the German lines. Now, it would appear this attack, which is described in the regimental history as a bluff attack, succeeded because the Germans were actually relieving their own troops at the time, and therefore the trenches were probably slightly undermanned. And the 2nd Essex men were not spotted until they were within 30 yards of the German trenches. It stated the Germans, or the enemy, hastily evacuated the trenches at Desborough Farm Crossroads, so we're taking that to be the main road at the top right there of the image, and the 2nd Essex quickly reoccupied them, finding them to be filled with dead from both sides, and they stay there and repulse a couple of counterattacks. Now, Captain Purcell was quite interesting. To give him his full name, he was Captain Baronet Paul Purcell. Now, the baronetcy of the Purcell baronetcy. The baronetcy was associated with a small town in Essex called Paglesham, and had been created in March 1797 as an award for Lieutenant Colonel Paul Purcell. Now, our Captain Purcell was also named Paul after him, and was in fact the 8th baronet, and he will return to our story kind of quite frequently. And they're in this area of Chapelle d'Armentes. And we can see here King's Own, Essex, marked down on the trenches that they're holding in the next few days. And speaking of people returning to our story, we have A.E. Maitland returning to us. Now, this picture is a picture from the Aisne, and he was the machine gun officer. And he had been injured and evacuated. But in early November, he returns to the battalion. And in his diary, he writes the following. Soon after, we started to make a better job of the gun emplacement by erecting overhead cover and lowering the position of the gun. We'd got a good bit of it done, and I was off to inspect Corporal Allen and his party. In my absence, Sergeant Camp was hit in the throat and killed. The bullet came through the loophole, the mist had risen suddenly, and the shot was fired at one of the men working on top. And that was on the 8th of November. In his diary entry for the 9th of November, he notes the following. We had just finished burying Sergeant Camp and a French civilian one of my men found in the ditch. and were getting back into the trench when the cursed sniper got Sykes in the back, and the poor fellow died in my arms about 3 minutes afterwards. He was the best man in my section, was the general favourite. This happened at 7 a.m. Now, both Camps and Sykes were originals. They had come over with the battalion on the 22nd of August 1914. Camp was from Suffolk, and Sykes was from Stratford, which at the time, whilst it's East London, was also treated as being part of Essex. And neither of them have got a known burial, and they're commemorated on the Plugstreet Memorial, which is not that far from where this action was. Carrying on with Maitland's diary, the battalion are basically in the line and experience a lot of shell fire, occasional attacks, and it's a kind of a really miserable experience anyway. But on the 11th, they are attacked. The Germans attack a nearby wood, and there was much shelling on their position, and local farms were set on fire. Now, 8 p.m, the enemy attacked again on the left, and probably not just the 2nd Essex, but troops in the area found they were having problems keeping their rifles and machine guns clean. On the 12th, the HQ area, which is where the machine gun officer would often be spending his time, was shelled, and Maitland refers to this in his diary. We had an awful night last night. At about 7 p.m, when it was raining very heavily and blowing half a gale, a heavy shell fire started, followed by heavy rifle fire. And then, of course, my gun jammed. Nothing on earth would make it fire after the first 2 rounds. Barnett, Corporal Tippins and I struggled with it in vain, and eventually we had to dismount it. I and Barnett took it into the dugout and did everything we could to think to it, leaving Corporal Tippins giving rapid fire through the shell hole. Now, Corporal Tippins, who we see here on the right and Maitland on the left, is quite an interesting character in himself. Now, in the diary entry there that I've just mentioned, we saw or heard that it was Corporal Tippins, but the observant amongst you might notice that he's Sergeant Tippins in this picture. Well, Tippins was actually a renowned shot. He had shot for England, he'd been a member of the Empire team, and had actually competed in the 1908 Olympics shooting. He'd been in the sort of reserves, not reserves, like the territorial force of the Essex Regiment. And when the war broke out, he was not with the 2nd Battalion, but he was so keen to serve overseas, he took a reduction in rank. Now, the mention there about the machine gun failing and Tippins still shooting away, in some newspaper accounts which were to come out later, it says that Corporal Tippins had taken his own rifle across with him to the front. And in the reports that were written later in the month of November 1914, it says how he's accounted for 37 of the enemy just with his own rifle. So I don't know if those two stories kind of overlap. Now, this was a hard time for the battalion, and you look at the war diary, every day or so there's a list of casualties. One of the casualties, just as an example of the many men that served, is Lance Corporal Arthur Beatwell. We can see here from a picture from before the war with the Broderick cap that was part of the uniform of the time. He was from West Hanningfield near Chelmsford in Essex, and he died on the 18th of November 1914. Now, he's buried in Twarlborough's Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery, but many of the men that died during this period, their bodies weren't recovered. When you look at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission records, it says that Arthur's brother also fell. Now, whilst I've just said that many of the men are commemorated on the Plugstreet Memorial, like Camp and Sykes, just nearby there is a cemetery, Calvary Cemetery, which is very much an Essex Regiment cemetery. I'll show you on a map in a moment or so the location of where the cemetery is and how it links in with the Essex Regiment's history. But again, as one example for the many men that served, one of the people buried there is Captain Rose. Now, Captain Rose arrived with the battalion, or arrived overseas, on the 15th of November 1914. He'd been born in India in 1871 and had served in South Africa and India, and had actually retired from the military in 1912, but was recalled and went through a period of service at home, and as I've already said, came over on the 15th of November 1914 and was killed on the 23rd of November 1914, so just about 8 days later. So to the fact about this being an Essex Regiment cemetery, this is a map of the area. We've already seen some of the names on here. Desborough Farm, for example, Captain Purcell's attack from a minute ago. Just up to the right of that is Pompadour Farm, or Pompadours was a nickname for the 2nd Battalion in the Essex Regiment. Chelmsford Cottages, I mentioned Beatwell was from West Hanningfield near Chelmsford, so Chelmsford is a town in Essex. And if we come further to the left of the picture, the west as it would be on a map, we can see Essex Hoe, Essex House, we're going to take that to be. And if we, with the magic of the internet, now lay this trench map over a modern day map, we can see that Essex House and Calvary Essex Military Cemetery combine. And here's a picture of the cemetery as a general overview, and that is a house next to it, which is roughly on the location of Essex House. Now, one of the other people buried there is Corporal Tippins, and he was killed on the 26th of November 1914. And it's in the obituaries that are written about him that we hear about that shooting and taking his own rifle and accounting for 37 of the enemy. Now, as I always said, it was a very difficult time for the battalion, in and out of the line, moved around, and the conditions were deteriorating as it went into winter, which is never pleasant in northwest Europe. One of the things that's famous from the First World War is the idea of the Christmas truce, and I start the presentation with a picture taken from the London Illustrated News of the soldiers fraternising in no man's land. Well, it's a sort of bit of a strange distinction, but it's possible the 2nd Essex were part of the first people to take part in these truces. And we can see here in the battalion war diary from December the 11th, 1914, slight frost, foggy, 10 a.m, officers and men of A&D Company meet Germans halfway between the lines. Germans say they are fed up. Regiment occupying trenches of the 181st Regiment and 19th Saxon Corps. Trenches appear to be held in about the same strength as ours and in same state. And whilst we've got the picture up here of the romanticised version of the Christmas truce, no reference to football there, some of you will notice. A Private H. Scrutton, which I think is Harry Scrutton, wrote to the local papers after the event, and he wrote to his relatives actually, Wood Green, who then passed on the letter to the newspaper. As I've told you before, our trenches are only 30 or 40 yards away from the Germans. This led to an exciting incident the other day. Our fellows have been in the habit of shouting across the enemy, and we used to get answers from them. And in the newspaper article, it sort of illustrates an exchange in the sort of language of the time, and ultimately the soldiers do go out and meet in no man's land. One of the people that was witnessing this was Lieutenant Brabazon, and we will see a picture of him shortly. Now, one again say everyone thinks of the Christmas period as a period of celebration and so on, but again, a strange kind of marker for the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment is that Private Archibald Brown had deserted from the battalion in November 1914. According to reports, he'd been sent back with a sick or wounded man to make sure he got back to the medical aid post and disappeared. And some days later, he was found in a French building or in a local building in local clothing and was arrested. And it was eventually tried or court-martialed, as we can see here from the image from the brigade and divisional orders, on 3 charges, being absent and stealing clothes. And there was also some talk about potentially having tried to escape. Now, many people were court-martialed, and if I bring up the next image, we can see a list here of many men that were being court-martialed at the time. And there may well have been a discipline problem. Many of these are absence, and there's also similar ones of drunkenness appearing in the brigade war diaries. But in Private Brown's case, his sentence was death, and of the 3,000 or so British soldiers that were sentenced to death, approximately 300 were actually executed, and Private Brown was one of those, and he was executed on the 19th of December. Now, his burial has subsequently been lost, and he is commemorated on the Plugstreet Memorial, and he's also now commemorated on the Ingatestone War Memorial, which is the town in Essex where his family were, and it's a relatively recent memorial, and his details were put onto that. So we actually approach Christmas, and on Christmas Day, the 25th of December 1914, the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment find themselves returning back into their trenches. Whilst the First Battle of Ypres officially finished in late November 1914, the 2nd Battalion is going to find itself staying in this area around Plugstreet Wood, around Armitaires, the famous Armitaires, as in Mademoiselle from Armitaires, and sitting out a very dreadful and uncomfortable winter. So when we return in the next episode, we'll be taking the battalion into 1915. Will this be the year in which the war is finished?